Welcome to the Communicating Earth podcast by Climate Acceptance Studios. This is the podcast by and for climate and nature communicators. So it gives me great pleasure this week to invite in Rachel Orr. She's the CEO of Climate Outreach, which is the first British charity to focus exclusively on public engagement with climate change. And so the work for our international audience is something that I highly recommend that you check out. It shaped a lot of my thinking around how I take my company forward. And especially like the free to access Climate Visuals Library, I've been using that for several years now. It's the world's only evidence-based and impact-focused climate photography resource, and it's free. Rachel spent most of her career working to change public opinion and influence policy to combat poverty, starting with the homeless charity Shelter and then Oxfam, before leading a network community-led housing project. She moved into climate with her role at Climate Outreach in 2023, but she does remain chair of the board of the Refugee Council. She believes that you should put people at the heart of the green transition, so that it is not something that is to be done by them, but rather something they feel a real part of. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So, so firstly, like why that transition? So you have this very obvious and clear focus on combating poverty, but then you switch into climate in 2023. So tell me a bit about that journey. Why did that happen?
So I've kind of thought about climate and being at organisations that are thinking deeply and advocating about kind of the impacts of climate change. So as you said, I ran the domestic poverty programme at Oxfam, but obviously you get to work with a bunch of amazing campaigners and advocates thinking about different issues, of which kind of climate and nature was a big focus. But really, it was when I was leading a network for housing associations in some of the kind of poorest parts of the country. And I remember sitting down with a group of CEOs and saying, like, what's the wicked challenge that is really keeping you up at night? This was kind of 5 or 6 years ago. And so many of them said, it's the green transition. How do we get all these properties that we are responsible for up to EPCC and then EPCA? And really interestingly, what a number of them said was, look, we're obviously worried about the financing. You know, we couldn't do this overnight tonight. It would bust our business plans. But, you know, we'll figure that out. And we don't think the tech's quite there yet, but we have faith that the tech will come. The really wicked challenge that they were grappling with is, like, how do you bring residents and communities with you? How do you, as one leader put it, like, how do I sit down with a woman whose kids share a bed and tell her that the upgrade I'm going to do to her property isn't going to get her another bedroom, but it's going to get her a heat pump? How do I have a conversation where she kind of feels that is something that is important for the community and the country, but is also going to kind of improve her life? And like you, I started going, there must be organisations who can help with these wicked challenges, and came across the wealth of insight and information that Climate Outreach has been pulling together for the best part of 20 years. And then when the opportunity came up to lead them, it was one I kind of couldn't let go by.
And there's been a definite shift, I think, in the tactics of the fossil fuel PR machine from it's not happening to it is happening, but it's too expensive. And bearing in mind that you're battling poverty and the wealth gap all the time. Firstly, do you see that in your work? And then secondly, does your past experience working in poverty inform countering that PR challenge?
Yeah, I think it's always really good to have a really clear-eyed view of what you're up against. And actually, like, what you can learn from the people who are making the opposing argument to yours. There are a lot of loud voices and vested interests who had a different view about poverty to the one that I had and the organisation that I work for. And I would absolutely say that the same is true about climate and nature. So yeah, being really kind of clear-eyed about that opposing voice. But I do think there's an awful lot that we can learn in terms of, some of the focus on message discipline, in terms of listening to your audience and chiming in with things that they really care about, and in terms of being bold about your story rather than being kind of backed into a corner about telling your opposition story. And I actually think there's a lot in those three kind of lessons that we should all keep front of mind.
And it is also cheaper. Ultimately, the green transition is now being proven unequivocally to be cheaper than business as usual.
So I think this is a really important shift that we need to almost kind of take a step back from and think about how we retell that story. Because for a long time that wasn't true. I think part of the really hard job of kind of a lot of climate communication of the past 20 years is we were asking people to make these changes because of, you know, this huge challenge called climate change that we all needed to kind of rise up to thinking about how we would tackle it. And actually, the experience of things that were better for the planet was almost always that they were more expensive. And it is still true, unfortunately, that in people's kind of day-to-day lives, that can often be the case. I grew up in Scotland. I really like going up to the Highlands of Scotland. I'd like to go there on the train every time I go. It's usually about 4 times more expensive for me to get on a train up to the Highlands than it is for me to get on a plane, right? So there are still a lot of proof points in people's lives that actually the environmental choice is not the cheaper choice. But there are an awful lot now where that is not true, but a lot of people don't believe that. Like when you go and, you know, whenever we run focus groups and we say, you know, this is how inexpensive solar is or the price of an EV, people don't believe that yet. And actually some people think that there is it's fundamentally at odds. So I think we need to put a real focus on this now. And it, you know, it isn't true for everything. And of course there's a cost associated with the green transition. But the other bit of the story is there is a massive cost to not doing anything. I think there was a stat out last week, they reckon more than 2 billion was lost in lost productivity in the recent UK heat waves. We need to be telling the story of the kind of cost of climate impacts now. But yeah, it actually showing people about the cost savings, because we're getting to the point where this is a win-win, but most people do not know that and do not believe it. So I think there's a huge communications job in that, but it's an exciting one, right? That is a good news story, and we haven't had so many of them. So let's think about how we really kind of grab hold of that and harness it.
Oh, I could talk about this forever, but I must remain focused on the mission of the podcast. So we start off with a bit of identification. So you've already said that you are an advocate. Is that how you identify yourself, or how would you identify yourself in your work?
I'd probably call myself a campaigner, I think.
Okay.
I'm for me, thinking about how change happens and how we sort of can, as individuals, as organisations, as institutions, help make change happen in different ways is the thing that has really kind of guided, I suppose, my career, whatever the issue is that I'm kind of campaigning or advocating for.
And how would you define it? What is a campaigner in a sentence to you?
Someone with an idea of how you can make the world a little bit better.
Very nice. Very good. Very good. So I'm sure you're aware by now, and our audience definitely is, that we're a big believer in this idea that it's tales of action that inspire action. So I'm really interested to see within your career what is a tale of action that you have taken as a climate communications leader in order to inspire more action. So so what's your tale of action?
So the tale of action I'd like to talk about is the kind of production of our Britain Talks Climate and Nature research that Climate Outreach published last year. And in some ways, it was a build on things that had gone before. So in 2020, Climate Outreach published the first kind of Britain Talks Climate and Nature toolkit. And you know, I wasn't working for the organisation or in the sector then, but I've heard, you know, tell about how much of an impact it had, how much cut through it had. Because it was built on a kind of audience segmentation model. So it sort of said, look, across the country, people are worried about climate change and they really care about it. But people have different values, different worldviews, different beliefs. And so the way that we can engage with people to get the kind of best possible response when we're communicating about climate and nature perhaps needs to be a bit different for those different audiences. And here's some thoughts on how we might do that. And there's been various smaller pieces of work over the years that have built on that. But we had the opportunity last year, working with our partners More in Common, to kind of look at that audience segmentation again and do a new piece of work that as I say, feels like a kind of development and an evolution, but made it relevant and up to date in 2025. And for me, there were kind of some really key things that I wanted us to think about. One is everything that climate outreach tries to do is to think about what's the evidence about what works. What do we know? What evidence are we collecting? What evidence have others collected? But to turn that evidence into practical, useful, usable insights for people. There's a brilliant line that we kind of say quite a lot at work. What if the answer to all of our questions was in PDFs that nobody reads? And I'm actually quite a big believer in that, right? I think we have quite a lot of the answers, but it's about getting those answers into the hands of people who need to use them every day. And we're not so good at that. So how can we make this a really rich, thoughtful research piece, but that can be as practical and useful as possible? The second thing I wanted to think about was kind of where are we at politically, what's happening in the kind of political cycle, and how can this be useful for people from different political parties who are communicating about climate and nature, and how might it be useful for the government of the day as well, governments of the day. We did a kind of deep dive into people in Scotland and people in Wales as well. But then finally, when I joined Climate Outreach 3.5 years ago, people were really talking about the fact that we had this cross-party consensus on the need to tackle climate change. And as someone who'd worked on different areas of social policy, this was entirely new to me, you know, that we had kind of Conservative prime ministers with support across the House, you know, signing into law, like long-term legislation. I thought it was incredible and wonderful and amazing. And that has shifted. The cross-party political consensus has shifted. The cross-party public consensus has not. So I wanted to think about how we could produce some work that didn't pretend that change wasn't happening, but that wasn't too kind of buffeted by it as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those were the kind of key considerations as we were kind of embarking on the work, and the things I kind of tried to keep really tight hold of throughout the project.
Okay, so let's get on to the results later, but for now I want to talk more about this transition. So you've come in to lead in an organisation where it's already up and running, and indeed, you know, that research was my gateway into climate outreach originally. I found out about that first and then you guys second. So what were the first steps that you took, say, internally in order to, you know, stand on the shoulders of the previous giants who worked at climate outreach and push it forward in this new direction that you previously outlined?
So I think the key thing was actually giving the current staff team the confidence to say the original product was great. And it was exactly the product that was needed at the time. We are going to build on a lot of those foundations, but actually we need to have the confidence to design the product that is right for now. You know, that actually the people who were responsible for the idea and the delivery of the first Britain Talks Climate don't work for Climate Outreach any longer. We're in touch with them. They're brilliant. They were huge helps as we were you know, kind of defining the second project. But actually, I think a couple, especially of my more junior colleagues, were almost a bit intimidated by how successful the first one had been. You know, here were we tasked with doing the second album, right, after the hit of the first. So actually, a big bit of the job was saying, what is the tool, what is the product that we think our users need now? And actually, how can you as my colleagues have some confidence to put your stamp on this in the same way that the people who did the original research did? And actually, what we did was we went and asked people. We had 3 months at the start of the project, and we ran in-person workshops in Scotland and in Wales, and 2 in England. And then we had a whole load of kind of bilateral calls as well with people we know who'd used the original toolkit, people who subscribe to our newsletter, people who we'd like to use the research, you know, who we didn't have such strong relationships with, and with funders. And we said to them, you know, what do you really value? What would you like this to do more of? How would you like it to be different? And, a lot of what we heard, I think I probably expected. So a lot of people said, literally tell me how to change my comms, how to change my messaging. And so the new research has a kind of toolkit where you can put in a kind of area of policy, and it gives you some drop down options for some recommended messaging. So that was a kind of innovation and an iteration. But actually some of the other really interesting things that came through that I wasn't expecting. So a lot of people said to us, we'd love you to do some public insights work about farming and how people sort of connect farming and farmers to the cause of climate change and nature, because our hunch is that actually people see farmers as really compelling messengers on climate, and we don't think there's enough work that's been done in that area. And we did that work and they were right. But it was really nice to be able to kind of include some specific research questions that we might have included as a team. It was certainly something we were talking about, but the kind of strength of the feedback that came from those kind of sector conversations really just kind of cemented that for us.
So how come, what led you to make these suppositions in the first place that were eventually proven by the research?
What do you mean?
Well, because you said I was right? You said I went into this process and ultimately I was right.
So I mean, we've obviously we do a lot of smaller pieces of research. We run a lot of webinars. We speak to a lot of people. We're also really lucky that we get invited to be part of kind of longer term projects and pieces of work where we work with community groups or in kind of partnership projects and help people think through their kind of climate story and their climate communication. And we hear a lot, you can give people an awful lot of insight and they're fascinated and they love it, but there's usually some poor comms person who's, there 2 days a week and they're like, this is amazing and fascinating, but it's kind of overwhelming. What should I say on social media and what should I not say? Actually, people want and need, I think, that advice now to be a bit more definitive. Mm-hmm. Not everybody. What some people need is to be able to sit with, a bunch of insights. But actually, I think as more and more organisations are thinking about how they communicate about climate and nature, and maybe in particular organisations who don't see themselves as climate organisations, so putting my head back into, the communications officers at housing associations, most of their comms is about repairs and about, regulation, and then all of a sudden they need to think about, how do I talk to tenants about retrofit? I'm not quite sure how to do that. So actually, how can we help make that as simple as possible for them, and make the guidance as kind of specific and kind of crystallising as possible?
So you've got firstly this internal piece, and then leading on to obviously the external piece. I mean, what were the challenges that you faced along the way?
I mean, I think, as ever with a kind of big year-long research project, there is a kind of, how are you going to make sure your project hits all your deadlines, and how do you keep the kind of engagement and motivation of your team throughout that process? I think as well, I mean, Climate Outreach isn't a huge team. And part of what I really wanted to do was think about, are there ways for everybody in the team to engage with this a bit? Because I think it can feel, if you're part of a team and, 2 or 3 people are working on, the big foundational organisational piece, those people are worried about the kind of enormity of the project that they're running, but actually the rest of your team can feel quite left out, and their work is not as important as the big project that's kind of going on over here. So I was really conscious about that, and really conscious about how can we all feel part of this? How can everybody in the organisation kind of be involved in some ways, although obviously to kind of greater or lesser extents. And, making sure that when we were running focus groups, everybody could come and observe them if they wanted to. So things like that. So there was a kind of ownership across the whole team. As I've said, this is a partnership project. We run the research in partnership with More in Common, and the funder has always been the European Climate Foundation. Mm-hmm. So there is always the challenge of how are you working with those partners throughout the process, throughout, the final kind of advice and recommendations, and making sure that everybody is in agreement with the kind of findings and the sort of presentation of the research and the findings. And then we set ourselves a deadline of September, and I wanted the research to be out before party conferences. so that we could go and kind of engage with the various political parties. So, it's always a challenge making sure that you can run at this and kind of stick to those deadlines. And I think along the way, it's easy to think about how you get buffeted by events, when something interesting happened and we knew we'd done a bunch of focus groups and had some answers on it, it was really tempting. My first job was a press officer. I'm a kind of, still think of myself as a kind of media and campaigns person, first of all. And I'd be like, oh, there's a story out. Maybe we can just put out this little bit of insight. Yeah. It was usually my team pulling me back and being like, no, you've said we hold it all back until September. But there were a couple of moments where...
I'm so guilty of that myself, on my word.
And that was always the right call. They were always right to pull me back. But there was there were moments when I thought, I wish we could just kind of jump on this right now. But that would have blown us off track, and it was not the right call. So yeah, I think it was just kind of steering through all of that, really.
So therefore, therefore you've got, a team that is, has the confidence to sort of take you on. So in your management style as a comms director, what were the tactics that you used to create that culture of confidence with your team? So
I think leadership, I think pretty much all communication is much more about listening than it is about talking.
Okay.
So, I have and again, it's not a huge team, so I think I'm lucky that I have a kind of personal relationship with everyone in my team, which is harder the bigger the organisation that you run. So I think kind of personal relationships, listening to colleagues. I've always said to people, I think you are the expert in your job. I should be the expert in mine. So, my job is not to come in and lean into the detail or the specifics of your job. But actually, there's some things that I am paid to do that nobody else is. So, what is the risk? What is the opportunity? What are some of the kind of high level kind of strategic questions that we kind of wrestle with? And trying to kind of step out the way and encourage people to take the decisions that are right in terms of their job. So, if you're a researcher, you tell me what the research questions should be. If there's one that I think is off strategically or is going to create a risk for climate outreach, I'm going to veto it because, that's my job. But, I want you to kind of come forward and be excellent in your job. I think we take risks together and we make mistakes together. And any leader who says they don't make mistakes is lying. So, but that's fine. Like, if we make a mistake, we learn from it, we, fix it together, and then we move on. Give me an example of a mistake then, if you're comfortable doing so. What would be a mistake that you would have made? I think kind of day to day, it's more judgments than mistakes, right? So you'll make a decision and look back on it 2 weeks later and think, actually, I probably could have made a different decision there. I could have chosen answer A rather than chosen answer B. Or the thing I'm more often guilty of is going, let's do 5 things, and then a week later going, maybe we should have just done 3. I'm getting better at checking myself before I say that, but my instinct is always, let's push and do more, let's push and do more. Mm-hmm. I've become more comfortable as a leader saying to some of my, especially more senior colleagues, like, this is who I am. And a lot of the time I think that's good, but actually sometimes I need you to say, maybe not this time. Or actually the thing is, I think the other thing is, it's sometimes easier for you as a leader to be like, let's do these 5 things. And you need somebody to go, I haven't got the capacity to make all those 5 things happen. I've got the capacity to make 3 things happen. And you can go, okay, great, brilliant. We can kind of work with that. And then I think the kind of, bigger mistakes or judgments are usually, I think, in our world about sort of missed opportunities, So could we have played our media strategy differently and got more media coverage for this? Could we have, spoken to some different people who gave us more challenging answers to the questions that we asked? Could we have, thought a bit differently about some of the kind of, tech that backed up our website? It's probably more in that kind of space. I've made some decent sized mistakes at various points in my career that maybe is a subject of a different podcast, but it's probably more those things. But I just think if you create a culture of saying to people, like, we'll all make judgments that someone else disagrees with or that we regret 2 weeks later, or I'd much rather someone came to me and said, I dropped a ball, like I I didn't do that thing and now we've got to fix it, than hid it and pretended that it didn't happen, because like that happens to all of us.
I sympathise and empathise with so much of that, especially the trying to do too many things at once and being sort of over ambitious and all the time having to rein myself back. And I do exactly the same thing with my team as well. Okay, so I'm really interested actually to sort of in the nuts and the bolts of it, like the how of it. So like how do you control the data? Like what platform do you use? What sort of software do you use?
So what do you mean in terms of when we're...
Well, your research data, right? So because ultimately our audience is other climate communicators. They might have analogous projects. You could recommend a piece of software to them or an overall process to manage an analogous project.
We haven't got high-tech software.
Okay.
We've got some good kind of lo-fi database for our storage, and then actually quite a lot of our conversion to the sort of narrative that you see on our website is us plugging that in, is us doing that. I think there's a big question for us in what the next Britain Talks Climate and Nature looks like, about how that is more kind of tech enabled. I think, the advances in AI are clear for us all to see, both the opportunities and the kind of challenges and risks to, some of the work that we do and some of the platforms that we've built. And so we built a little bit of that into this iteration. But I think the next one will probably need to look and feel kind of more different again.
I mean, I want to talk about AI, but there goes an hour. So maybe we need to be more like sort of focused. Okay, and also, so you've got a bunch of stakeholders that you're communicating with to drive the project forward. You talked about how you managed to do that from your internal team to obviously the research subjects and the researchers through to your funders. So what did you do? Did you have like a weekly Zoom call, or was there... how did you communicate to everybody? And indeed, did you communicate to like different people in a different way, or was it all very egalitarian?
Intentionally egalitarian? No. So we obviously did the kind of internal project management. The core team is meeting this often. This is when we're updating the rest of the organisation.
But how often? I'm interested to see how often. Like once a week?
Our core team met at least once a week. So
Okay.
we had a weekly hour, and then there would, sometimes, especially when we got nearer to the launch, it moved to twice. We had, and again with Maureen Common, our research partners, obviously when we're in the research delivery, you're talking to each other every day. And then when you move to the project write-up, it's more a kind of, let's check in every couple of weeks because we want to check that you're happy with how the research and the data is being presented. And ditto with ECF. And then with the kind of broader sector, as I say, we did the kind of big consultation piece at the start. And then we sent a couple of update emails to people over the course of the next 6 months. Like we couldn't allow the process to be like entirely collaborative throughout. That wasn't going to be possible. We don't have the staff resource internally to kind of manage that. And then when we were we were maybe about a month out, there were a couple of really kind of trusted kind of people in the sector who we asked for a bit of a second opinion on a couple of things. But mainly it was updating the sector on kind of when we were publishing, what the kind of plans for the kind of launch and publication were. And then about a month out, we did a kind of list of who we wanted to do some advanced briefing on the findings. So we were really conscious of the elections in May 2026 in Wales and Scotland, and actually in the summer of 2025, that's when kind of climate campaigners in those countries and indeed manifesto writers from the parties were really starting to think about what was going to be in those manifestos. So in terms of some of our advanced briefing, we spent kind of a lot of time thinking about getting in front of the sector and the parties in Wales and Scotland, but also some advanced briefing with some key leaders in the climate and nature sector, with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and with DEFRA, so that people had a sense of what was coming before we launched the sort of full report. And I think that was really good as well. You got bits of kind of feedback from those conversations, which we plugged into the final report. But it felt like that we had a kind of a growing bank of kind of support before it finally launched as well.
Fantastic. So I want to move on to talk. I'm really interested to find out about what you said earlier on in this podcast about how do we take the contents of that PDF, the contents of that research, and get your audience to actually engage in it and use it. But before we do that, we've got our quick fire round, which in the history of this podcast, I've now rechristened the medium fire round because the quickness maybe has fallen by the by, but we'll give it a go. Okay. So here we go. So brief answers if you can. Are you ready?
I am.
What's the first word that comes to mind when I say climate?
Hot.
Very appropriate right now. Who is your greatest inspiration within climate and nature communications?
So about 4 years ago, I met a guy called Paul. He was working for a housing association in the northeast of England. Geordie with a strong Geordie accent. And he'd quit his job as a plumber to work entirely on retrofit and heat pump installations for a housing association because he'd seen David Attenborough and then he'd started reading about climate. And I remember him saying, it feels like everybody else who talks about climate is either a scientist or really posh, and I'm neither of those things, but I think we need people like me. And I just completely agreed with him and thought the way he was kind of going about making little changes to people's lives and talking about climate in a language that made sense to him and to the kind of customers and communities he was serving was amazing.
And is he the person whose work you think should receive more attention, or is there someone else?
Absolutely.
Very good. I quite agree. What's your favourite piece of culture, like a book, a movie or a TV show related to climate and nature?
So again, I'm for pieces of culture that aren't fully in your face about climate and nature. I remember years ago when I worked for Shelter and we would spend long periods of time going, how can we get people to talk positively about social housing on Coronation Street or EastEnders, which seemed to be the kind of pinnacle of sort of cut through comms. So the latest Bridget Jones movie, I think has a lot of really clever, subtle, gentle references to climate and nature. Like Bridget goes to Hampstead Heath and other places and kind of talks about nature being really healing. There's a scene where she's kind of briefing to talk to the new environment minister and kind of acknowledging the sort of quiet care and concern that we all have for climate change. And it looks as if she's read all of Britain Talks Climate and Nature. I'm not sure if she has, but some of those really kind of subtle, gentle pieces of comms. But for a more erudite answer, I'm just finishing Pete Betts' brilliant book, The Climate Diplomat, which I just found really fascinating and fantastic. It's a world I know a bit less about, but I think understanding how that kind of world of diplomacy works, and the amount of passion and time and care that people spend, often with the rest of the world knowing nothing about it, I also find really inspiring.
Do you know, going back to Bridget Jones, whether there has been an advocacy organisation in the background influencing that script?
I'm not sure. There is a brilliant organisation called Herd who do quite a bit of work influencing kind of film and TV, and some other new organisations being set up as well, whose names I'm not going to remember, and then I'm going to kick myself afterwards, but kind of Climate Reframe, and Lucy Stone's doing some great work too. So I think there's bits of that happening. And Climate Outreach, we've done some really good work with some of the kind of big broadcasters too, but it's much more kind of presenting them with the insights rather than being able to then go, okay, let's help you with the storyline. But I think that kind of how we plug climate into culture is being thought about and being funded more than I see in other areas, right? There isn't an infrastructure thinking about how you can get positive stories about refugees and people seeking asylum into popular culture, right? Like some of the infrastructure that is being created and funded in climate is, I think, really exciting and just what we need.
And the fossil fuel industry is definitely doing it in American TV right now, 100%. I mean, you look at Yellowstone, for example. What's your favourite communications channel?
Talking to people.
That's the number one answer, by the way.
Yeah, talking to people. But yes, radio is my medium of choice.
Okay. And do you think that's the most effective?
I don't know. I was listening to a lovely tribute to Ed Sturton a couple of days ago, who passed away, and I think it was Amal Rajan said, with radio, you feel like someone's really in your living room in a way you don't with some other mediums, which I really liked. Maybe it's because I like talking to people, but I think in terms of effectiveness, like what kind of gets cut through, what's the medium that most people consume? Like it's TV. It's kind of mainstream popular TV. Like if we want to reach the most people, that's I think still the channel that we need. With I suppose TikTok kind of running fast at it, but yeah, I think if we can get stuff on kind of mainstream broadcast telly for now, that's the most effective.
What's your favourite stat or fact about the climate nature crisis?
That you are 22 times more likely to remember information presented as a story than as a fact.
Very good. That's fantastic. I might have to nab that one.
You're welcome to it.
What's the one climate myth or misconception you'd like to permanently retire?
That we can throw more facts at people and myth bust. We can't myth bust our way out of this. We need to tell a new story. Very
good. Very meta. So what's your number one source of climate information personally?
I love Carbon Brief. I know that's not, it's kind of news, but I think it's an absolutely brilliant service. So I read that every day.
So let's go back to one of the cornerstones of storytelling, which is like metaphor. So what's your favourite metaphor to explain the climate crisis?
I don't know if it explains the climate crisis, but what we talk a lot about at Climate Outreach is we have to make this a people story, not a science story. It's still too often told as, degrees of warming, degrees of failure, and actually this is a story about people and how we're going to change and rethink the future and adapt to things and hopefully make things better. So I think the anchor is we have to make this a people story.
Very good, very good. Well, here ends the medium-sized or the quickfire round, whatever. But that was excellent. Okay, so let's go back to this new transition of your main flagship research project. By the way, like how much of like your year's work is it? You were talking about how some staff felt the pressure that was everything on that. How much of like your resources each year is devoted to Britain Talks Climate?
So it isn't every year. We're not kind of funded to run or rerun Britain Talks Climate and Nature every year. For any funders listening, if but when we are kind of supported to do it, it takes the best part of a year, probably 9 months. But from kind of the moment that we go, right, brilliant, we've got the green light, actually kind of teeing up the work, especially, you can run it more quickly, but having that, I think we had like 3 months where we were doing all the kind of engagement and consultation with various stakeholders, which I think made the research far better and far more well used because people had a kind of stake in the final piece. But really, it was probably only 2 members of staff for whom it was their kind of sole project. Mm-hmm. And then, as I say, there were probably 5 or 6 of us who dipped in and out at various times. So, for example, if you're the comms lead, you probably have quite a lot of engagement. Well, you do have quite a lot of engagement with it at the start because you're helping to do those kind of outreach with the sector and kind of collate what people say. But then when the research phase is running, you're spending less time week by week. But then when we get into the research write-up, and then obviously the kind of getting it out into the world, it becomes your full-time job. So there were, as I say, a couple of people for whom I think it sort of took over their working life and maybe a little bit of their wider life as well. Mm-hmm. And then a bigger team of kind of 5 or 6 of us who were involved to a greater or lesser extent at various points through the project. And then, like the whole team really pulled together at the end when we were out doing briefings and organising our launch event and everything. That the whole team was involved in that part.
And before I get onto the launch event, because I want to talk about that, a lot of our audience is international, and indeed I speak about you when I'm on the phone to people in the States or Australia or wherever. I mean, I know it says Britain Talks Climate, but is there value there for someone from Wisconsin reading this?
Yes. So this is built on a kind of audience segmentation of the UK, but I think if you're working in a kind of global north country, then you would be able to look at the research and the kind of audience segmentation and think about the people and communities that in the place that you work. Obviously, the more effective thing to do would be to do a kind of audience segmentation and then a similar piece of research that is more specific to the country that you work in. But I think you could have a look and see the kind of proxies, and indeed kind of there have been sort of similar research projects that have happened in some other countries, and maybe the segments are called different things, or maybe the profile is slightly different. But actually, I mean, essentially, you tend to find that there is a highly engaged segment in the Britain Talks Climate and Nature. We call them the progressive activists. So there may be different terms for that, but there are a cohort of people who are really passionate and active, but crucially see that kind of politics and political change is a real route to achieving what we need to. And then you'll probably have a segment who are really hard to engage. Now, in the UK, that segment, there are still ways in. There are ways in to talk to them about climate, and my suspicion is that would be true in other countries, but there might be some places where that kind of harder to reach segment is even harder. And then there's some groups in the middle, and there might be some slight kind of differences in terms of the way they sort of see the world, but actually I think it's much more about the views of that kind of that group, quite a big chunk of people in the middle, understanding them better. I think sometimes we make the wrong judgments about a lot of people in that cohort, but actually I think that really the key thing is like, how do you understand that group, and then how do you think more carefully about listening to them and tailoring communication for them.
I was struck what you said about PDFs at the start. One of my favourite phrases is the ways to save the world are trapped in 1,000 unread PDFs. So so let's go on to the launch, to the engagement. Like, how did you go about doing it? How did you go about people A, reading your research, and then crucially B, taking that next step to then taking action themselves? What were your tactics?
So we had 4 events, 3 in person, London, Cardiff and Edinburgh, and then we had a webinar that was really well attended, and those were great, right? Those were interesting. We had some fantastic speakers. Ed Miliband, who was the Secretary of State, came to the London launch. We had some really great political speakers in Wales and Scotland. Had really good engagement in the webinar, like really pleased. But actually, in terms of people using it, I think that is, a tenth of the story, really. The people who come to your launch event are the people who probably know about your product anyway, and probably are gonna use it. So what we really tried to do this time is kind of promote our work. We're sometimes I think we can kind of undersell ourselves. So actually kind of reaching out to people and saying, like, can we come and present this to your senior management team? Can we come and present this to your board? And we'd also designed a bespoke workshop, which we tailor to each organisation, but has a kind of core content about saying, let us come and sit with your key team and talk to you about our findings and the segmentation, but also like you can then bring your kind of comms challenge that you're struggling with, or the big question that you're kind of grappling with, and we can help you kind of think about how you would put that into practice. So I think that was really that really appealed to a lot of people and organisations, because we know that in some organisations the comms person is senior enough to make decisions that actually kind of verge into kind of strategy, whereas sometimes they're not. You might have someone who comes along and says, this is brilliant, but actually I need to go to my boss's boss's boss before I can think about how we implement this. And I think it's understanding not just the kind of external working environment that people have, but starting to understand that kind of internal working environment that they have, and saying, we can come and sort of help you with that. We can come and kind of work through that with you, and having that offer kind of ready to go. So there's a lot of kind of self-service you can do on the website. As I say, there's all the findings, and then we've got a toolkit where you can kind of find some specific guide messages. But actually we've done I don't know, it might be 100 now, kind of different kind of presentations and workshops with different organisations. right from, kind of really small community groups up to the wildlife trusts and the campaign to protect rural England, and actually kind of going like, what are the comms challenges you're struggling with? How can we situate them in some of the findings and some of the kind of audience segments? And then how can we help you think about what kind of words and phrases to use more of and which ones to use a bit less of? And actually what I found is that, yes, I think our research is really welcome. People always come away going, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or you've really underlined that for me. But actually a lot of the value is that you just create that space for a bunch of people to sit around and go, we've all kind of been grappling with something, right? And quite often people will come to us and say, we have this wicked comms challenge, can you give me the answer? And actually what you need to do is sit in a room with them and let them talk through the challenge and ask them some questions, and they've got the answer. It's just helping them to work through it and feel confident in it, feel confident in our story. I think the sector's taken a bit of a, we've had a tough couple of years and kind of more challenges to our story as being kind of the right one and the one that's kind of leading the charge. All of our evidence would show you that we are still the winning team. Yeah. 2/3 of people are worried about climate change. They say that they want more action to kind of fight it. That's great, right? But because it's felt harder in the last couple of years, I think we've sort of forgotten that we're the winning team. So actually quite a lot of what we do is just like remind and reiterate that to people, and I think help them get the confidence back to say, like, we've got the answers, we're doing good stuff, let's get out there and kind of be on the front foot again.
I mean, I think within the climate and nature communications sector, there's an overall macro challenge, which is the funding. I mean, and we actually know, we did our own research piece, not to the same level and quality of you. Hopefully in future years it will be, specifically to climate and nature communicators. And indeed, you guys very kindly participated in that. But like, it is funding. And I think the reason why specifically the communications part of the climate and nature sector is underfunded is because those funders want to have measures of impact, right? So how do you measure the changing of opinion, right? That then leads to action. How can you quantify, okay, my comms work has led to X million tons of carbon not being released into the atmosphere? So I mean, what would you say to all of that within the context of your work at Climate Outreach?
I think it's really, really hard to draw that line right through to the kind of carbon reduction. So I think this is a real challenge. I think this is a real challenge for people working in kind of comms and influencing, and the kind of added dimension for Climate Outreach is that we don't ourselves run campaigns. We work with other people who do. So we're also kind of saying, well, hang on a minute, once after we worked with you on that piece of advice, what did you do? And trying to get that kind of and about the impact kind of from them. I think the other thing is, like, sometimes, often, good comms doesn't have an impact straight away. So I think you're asking for an impact measure. I can't change my comms strategy. What's the impact tomorrow? Well, I can tell you about the metrics tomorrow. I can tell you about if we got more visitors to our website, or if more people clicked on our petition link, or if more people viewed our advert. But actually the impact of that, I don't think you notice for 6, 12, 18 months. So I think there's a bit more thinking for us to do. We're thinking about this quite hard at the moment about actually, can we go back to projects that we worked on 2 or 3 years ago and say to organisations, look, we worked with you on changing your comms framing and your comms advice. Could you tell us now if there's been what the impact has been of that? So we look at metrics, of course we do. The kind of classic ones about engagement on social media, engagement online, engagement in the media. We talk to organisations about if and how they've used our insights and how that shifted their communications, and get kind of testimonies about how they think that's kind of had an impact. But I do think the other thing we have to do is almost like take a bit of a step back. We're not very good at kind of going, what progress have we made, and kind of over what period, and kind of thinking about what shifts have we seen in kind of how we talk about climate over 2, 3, 5 years, and how might that have contributed to some sort of positive progress in the direction that we need it to go. So I don't think there's a kind of fixed answer on this. I think we try a bunch of things, and we're always interested to hear from and learn from other people who are asking themselves the same question.
So, like, if you had one of your not-for-profit clients come to you and say, like, "What I'm just doing my my fundraising bid for my next 3 years of core funding for my operations as a comms team. Like, please tell me, what should I say to my funders about why we have value?"
So I think we are the kind of your comms is your sort of, it's your door and your window and your front line. It's how do we bring more people in? How do we share with people the successes that have already been made? And we're the ones on the front line of the fight. There are more and more loud voices who are saying that this isn't what we should be doing and we should be doing something differently. And I think we are the people responding to that. But again, like we're also the people pointing to all the success and the progress, and we need more support to do that. Otherwise, I think we're going to increasingly get backed into a corner and just be responding all the time. And that would be the worst thing that could happen right now.
So, final question on this section is, what would be the biggest thing that you've learnt from this new iteration of Britain Talks Climate? And, this could be applicable to other people's work in our sector.
I think if you're creating a project or a product that you want people to use, involving them at the start in the design of that is just worth so much. It can feel a bit nebulous, and it can feel quite kind of time and resource intensive. But the product we designed and created was better. But also I know that more people have used it and spoken to other people about it because they were there at the beginning and felt a little bit of ownership of it. So I think if we're just kind of creating projects and products that we want others to use, and we haven't asked them before we kick them off, like, would this be helpful? What would be helpful? How could it be better? We shouldn't expect so much kind of use and engagement with it. Whereas if we really create the space and the time to do that, it really pays dividends.
Very good. Very good. It's interesting you're talking as much about like sort of leadership as specifically climate and nature. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so last section, which is sort of your opinions more generally. How do you see the future of our sector?
I think the climate and nature sector is packed full of really brilliant people, really passionate, really thoughtful, really wanting to make change happen. I think what we need to do is think about how we connect much more of the sort of national infrastructure with all the great stuff that's happening locally. There's loads and loads of action and, challenge that is happening in local communities, at local government level. And I think there is a bit of a disconnect between the kind of national infrastructure and resource and story and what is happening locally. And like, I was really struck in our research this year, the extent to which the story people need about climate is local. Global, even national, people aren't as engaged as a general rule as they were, when we asked similar questions 5 years ago. Is kind of what is happening at my kid's school, at my local rugby club, at the housing estate down the road. I can see solar panels on the roofs of new houses, So how do we, I think for us to continue to thrive and win, we need to think much harder about how we connect that kind of national picture in the national infrastructure to the local, and think about how actually like innovations on climate and nature are touching all sectors and different people's lives. What is much more of the story about education or about housing, rather than kind of purely about climate, if that makes sense. And I think that's a big job.
It does make sense, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, there was this phrase a few years ago which has died out in climate comms that I want to revive, which is glocal. I think glocal is like it's absolutely key to it all. We're all stuck in our little tribes of 150 people, and I also have this theory that I think like people like you and me are weirdos, right? There's a very small percentage of people who can actually like think about ourselves within the context of the bigger picture in a way that demands that we change careers to do so. So I want to do a bit of research piece into people like us and what is different in our psychology and our DNA that we've chosen to do this rather than, in my case, make a lot of money in the private sector, which I could have done. So I mean, this next question obviously doesn't apply. I mean, okay. So do you see yourself as like part of the climate communication science sector? Do you consider what you do to be a science?
Yeah, I do. Maybe not me specifically, but I have researchers, fantastic researchers in my team, who are real experts in their field. I think my job is kind of taking those findings and insights and thinking about how you tap that into what I know about comms and probably, like leadership and strategy more generally. But as an organisation, yes, I would say that.
And do you think overall the sector is following the science of climate communication enough?
There's good pockets.
Pockets.
I think.
I don't think.
I think the thing that we are least good at is celebrating progress. And I think that, it is partly because we are passionate advocates, and it's partly because we're weirdos who spend our time looking at the data, and the data is still terrifying.
Yeah.
So there is an urge and an instinct, which is completely understandable and natural, right? To lean more into, oh my gosh, look how bad it is, and look how much worse we think it is going to get. And that is true, and we need to keep saying it. But every single piece of kind of, climate comms research that I think anybody has ever done will find a version of, once you get out of our bubble, if all you do is scare people, you turn them off and you turn them away, right? Well, if we're all screwed anyway, then, what's the point? I'll just go on holiday and have a nice time, And what we have to do is think about, how do you balance the urgency with the agency?
Exactly.
So like every bit of comms that talks about how bad it could get, we need to give people a wee chink of light. If all we do is give people the darkness, we're just going to switch the majority of people off. So I think I definitely see some real shifts in terms of how people think about a lot of their comms, which is really positive and really welcome. But we are terrible at talking about progress, because whenever a government or a company or whatever does something good, our instincts as advocates and campaigners is to go, brilliant, what's next? Instead of spending a bunch of time going, this really good thing just happened and more people should know about it, because we think we should be on to the next thing because there's so much more to do. And again, I have real sympathy with that, but I think it's the emphasising that we are making progress. Like, most people in this country don't think we've started addressing climate change, right? And when you give them some proof points of stuff that we've done, they're excited and they feel proud about it. And they're like, oh gosh, like actually we can do good stuff as a country, right? And I think that's the bit that we need to get much better at.
And also, aside from the fear-mongering, which obviously I agree with, I think just more generally, like, there's still this obsession around raising awareness. Awareness has been raised. People know what's going on. They know what's going on. Stop raising awareness. And I think that the reason why it's because it's easy, right? I mean, obviously it's very complex, but ultimately it's relatively easy to go and like measure, the parts in the atmosphere. Whereas to inspire action and change, that's a much harder job to communicate, because you're communicating the future rather than just assessing the present and the past. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think the other kind of challenge and opportunity we've got at the moment is what quite a lot of our comms needs to talk about is about like implementation. So, there was a job, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, where raising awareness and outlining the policies that we needed was the job. It was the job of advocates. It was the job of the kind of climate and nature sector. That's not the job any longer, right? We pretty much know which levers we need to pull. We know we need to transition away from fossil fuels towards renewables. That isn't to say that it is easy to do and there aren't huge numbers of, roadblocks in our way. We do need to obviously keep thinking about tech and innovation. And of course, there are some sectors where there is more thinking and more policy that we need. But actually, some of the biggest jobs we need to do are about implementation, right? Yeah. How do you properly, sensitively, thoughtfully talk to communities about why there need to be pylons running through their communities where they need to go and what benefits that community might have for that piece of infrastructure being there. Like, we need to put far more resource and energy and emphasis onto that, rather than, can we have 25 new policy reports about new policy areas? We don't need to, I'm not saying we need to stop that, but I just think there needs to be a rebalancing away from awareness raising and new policy to implementation.
Yeah.
And that is hard, and it's sticky, and you need to fund it over long periods of time. Wins on that, right? That's about building relationships and building trust. And I think that's starting to happen, but I think that needs to happen a lot more quickly.
What's the best piece of advice about climate comms that you've ever received?
Start by listening.
It's quite a common answer, that, yeah.
And you get it again when you talk to people about who do you most with you about climate change. And people will talk about the need for experts, right? Most people still think that people who have some kind of experience in the field, which doesn't mean you need to be a climate scientist. You could be a gardener, you could be a farmer. Like, there are different ways that people see expertise, but you need to have, some expertise. And you need to have some passion. But actually what people say is, like, do they understand what life is like for people like me? Because there is a perception of climate activists and advocates by some people that what we do when we show up is we make people feel guilty and we tell them they have to stop doing things that they like. That is, when you ask people, like, I'm here to talk to you about climate change, instinctively what do you expect? And they're like, you're going to make me feel guilty and you're going to tell me to stop flying, aren't you? And we have to get past that. But I think a bunch of that we have to do by listening and showing people that we want to listen to them and we want to understand their life before we start talking about climate and nature and what's happening. Start by listening.
So imagine the 21, 22, 23-year-old Rachel Orr coming out, blinking into the world for the first time, having finished your education and going, right, I want to have a career in climate comms. Like, what would you go back and say to your younger self? What would be the one piece of advice that you would give her starting out in her career?
Yeah, I'd definitely tell her to listen more. So I think the other thing that I've really found is that if you want to be a kind of passionate advocate for a cause, whether that's climate or like housing or poverty, actually, like, you have to be a good climate communicator yourself. So what is your story? You started off, didn't you? You asked me kind of, what's my journey been? Why am I here? And I think actually people knowing why this matters to you. And for some people, that is a personal story. It's a kind of lived experience. And for other people, it's people that they've met or other projects that they've got to work on or experiences that they've had. But I think that kind of how we all think of ourselves as kind of communicators for issues that we care about, and telling people why it matters to us is really invaluable. And I think, that can change over time. Part of the reason that I am so passionate about climate and nature is I have 2 kids and I'm in part petrified about the world we might leave them. And I want to leave the world in a decent place for them to enjoy their lives, So what is your story? How do you show up in these conversations with the story of you, as well as all the, passion and stats and whatever that you're also going to kind of throw around?
What do you think is the most important message that the public needs to hear right now?
We're making progress. We can do this. We can... this is full of opportunities. This is full of opportunities for British products, for British jobs, for us to do good things, and also to tackle climate change. Good things are already happening. More can. It's happening all around you. Here's how you can be involved. That's more than one message. But we are making progress. Let's do more of it.
Very good. I mean, tales of action, right? That's the people taking action already. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. And so for our final,
Tom, I think you're right. So there you go.
Final question is: right now, every single person whose career is climate and nature communications is listening. Everyone in the world. What would be the one strategy, the unifying international strategy that they should all be focused on within their work? So it doesn't have to be their overall work, but one thing that every single climate and nature communicator of the world should be doing as part of their job.
Talking about people and thinking about this as future proofing. How are we future proofing the kind of world we want to leave behind?
Rachel, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We've overrun slightly, and again, I wish we could have spoken for 2 hours. So we are very much, the podcast of working climate and nature communication professionals. So what's next on your to-do list? What's next on your calendar? What have you got coming up this afternoon?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I'm keeping a bit of an eye on the formation of Andy Burnham's government and who may be in or out in terms of some key ministerial roles. But actually, you started by talking about our brilliant climate visuals library. Climate visuals is 10 years old this year.
Wow.
And when we started it, we did some research about kind of what makes brilliant evidence-based climate photography. And I mean, that research has really stood the test of time and has been the kind of crucial underpinning for the climate visuals work. But actually, I think our reflection is the way people think about imagery has changed quite a lot and is changing, and the way we consume images is changing. So I'm going to go and spend some time with Alistair, who runs our brilliant climate visuals platform, and think about what do the next 10 years look like? How might we need to think about some of these research principles a bit differently? Can we redo some of that research and think about how we can get more of the kind of right images to be available and used on the Climate Visuals platform?
Amazing. And I'll put a link in the show notes. It's such a great resource. I understand everyone should be engaged with it and register. Rachel, thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thank you.